My name is Kevin Russell, and I'm 12 years old. If you ask me, this whole trip was a terrible idea from the start. My dad, Jack, thought it would be good for the family to spend a week together in the middle of nowhere, driving an old RV down some forgotten road in the woods. He called it bonding time, but really I think he just wanted to get away from his job for a while. My mom, Diana, wasn't thrilled about it either, but she figured it would give her a chance to take photos for her wildlife project. And then there's my sister Emma. She's 15 and hates everything. She didn't even pretend to like the idea. We packed up our 1989 Winnebago Warrior, which smelled like old socks and gas station coffee, and hit the road early one morning. Max, our golden retriever, was wagging his tail like this was the best day of his life. At least someone was excited. Dad decided to take us to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. The trees there are huge, like skyscrapers made of wood, and the air smells fresh and damp, like rain that never quite dries up. It's beautiful, sure, but also kind of creepy. The forest feels alive in a way that makes you look over your shoulder more than once. After hours of driving, we came across this old dirt road with a rusty sign that said no entry in faded red letters. Of course, Dad thought it was perfect. It's probably just an old logging road, he said with a shrug. Nobody's been here in years. Mom raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She was busy fiddling with her camera, muttering something about documenting deforestation for her project. Emma rolled her eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck that way. We drove down the road anyway, bumping along as the trees seemed to close in around us. It was like the forest didn't want us there. Max started whining softly from the back seat, his ears pinned back against his head. That should have been our first clue to turn around. The first weird thing we noticed were these massive footprints in the dirt next to the road. They were bigger than any animal tracks I'd ever seen, way bigger than bear tracks, and they looked almost human. But not quite. Dad laughed it off and said it was probably some prank by local kids. Mom took pictures while Emma muttered something about how lame this trip was. Then there were the carvings on the trees, strange symbols that looked like spirals and stick figures with long arms and legs. They weren't random scratches, they were deliberate, almost like some kind of language or warning. Mom got really quiet when she saw them, and started snapping photos like crazy. By the time we set up camp for the night, Max wouldn't stop pacing around the RV and growling at nothing in particular. "It's just squirrels," Dad said dismissively as he grilled burgers over a campfire that barely held back the darkness creeping in from all sides. But I wasn't so sure. That night was when things really started feeling wrong. Lying in my bunk inside the RV, I could hear noises outside, branches snapping under heavy footsteps and this low rumbling sound that made my chest feel tight, like thunder far away but without any storm. Emma had taken some photos earlier that day with her Polaroid camera, and when she showed them to me before bed, I swear I saw something strange in the background of one of them, a tall shadow between two trees that hadn't been there when we were standing outside. "Don't tell Mom or Dad," she whispered as she shoved the photo back into her bag. "They'll think we're making it up." I didn't sleep much that night. None of us did. The next morning, we found an old pile of loggers' equipment not far from where we'd parked, rusty chainsaws and helmets covered in moss and deep claw marks gouged into one of the tree trunks nearby. "A bear," Dad said again, though he sounded less sure this time. Mom crouched down next to one of the claw marks and ran her fingers over it thoughtfully before pulling out her camera again. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "it's big." Max wouldn't stop barking at something deeper in the woods until Emma finally dragged him back inside the RV. As we drove further down that abandoned logging road later that day, I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched. Not by one thing but by many things hidden just out of sight between those towering trees. And then we found fur samples tangled on a broken branch, thick strands longer than anything I'd ever seen on any animal before, and they smelled weird too, earthy but sharp at the same time. That night was worse than the first. The sounds outside grew louder, heavy footsteps circling around us, and when I peeked out through one of the windows after everyone else had gone to bed, or at least pretended to, I thought I saw movement in the shadows again, taller than any person should be. But when I blinked, it was gone. Something wasn't right about this place, and deep down, I think we all knew it. The next morning everything felt off. The air was colder and the forest was quieter, like the birds and animals had decided to pack up and leave. Even Max, who usually barked at anything that moved, just sat by the RV door with his ears down and his tail tucked between his legs. Dad tried to act like everything was fine. "We'll keep going a little further," he said, looking at the map like he had any idea where we were. "It's probably just an old trail that loops back around." Mom didn't say much. She was busy flipping through the photos she'd taken on her camera, her face serious. Emma was glued to her Polaroid pictures again, muttering under her breath about how weird they looked. I didn't need to see them again to know what she was talking about. I'd already seen that shadowy figure in the background of one of them. We packed up and kept driving down the narrow road. The trees seemed even closer now, their branches almost scraping the sides of the RV. Every so often, Dad would stop to check something, like tire tracks or broken branches, but he didn't say what he was looking for. By midday, we came across another strange sight, an old logging site that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There were rusted chainsaws, broken down trucks covered in moss, and piles of logs scattered everywhere. But what really caught our attention were the claw marks, deep gouges in the sides of the trucks and the trunks of nearby trees. They were too big to be from any animal I'd ever heard of. Maybe a bear, Dad said again, though he didn't sound convinced anymore. Mom crouched down near one of the trucks and picked up a tuft of fur caught on a jagged piece of metal. It was thick and dark brown, almost black, and way too long to belong to a bear or wolf or anything normal around here. She sniffed it and wrinkled her nose. "It smells strange," she said quietly, slipping it into her camera bag. Emma rolled her eyes but didn't say anything this time. I think even she was starting to feel uneasy. That night, things got worse. We parked in a small clearing surrounded by trees so tall you couldn't see their tops in the dark. Dad built another campfire while Mom set up her camera on a tripod nearby, pointing it toward the woods like she was expecting something to happen. Max wouldn't stop growling at the darkness beyond the firelight. His fur stood on end as he paced back and forth, his eyes darting toward the shadows like he could see something we couldn't. And then we heard it, a low, rumbling sound that made my chest feel heavy, like when you're underwater too long. It wasn't thunder or wind, it was something alive, something big. "What was that?" Emma whispered, clutching Max's collar tightly. "Probably just an echo," Dad said quickly, though his voice sounded shaky. But it wasn't an echo. The sound came again, closer this time, and then we heard branches snapping under heavy footsteps. Not just one set of footsteps but several, moving slowly around us in a wide circle. "Stay inside," Dad said firmly, as he grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the edge of the clearing. "Jack." Mom hissed, but he ignored her. I stayed by the window inside the RV with Emma, while Mom stood near the door with her camera ready. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as Dad scanned the trees, but whatever was out there stayed just out of sight, and then Emma gasped. "Look," she whispered urgently, pointing toward one of her Polaroids lying on the counter next to us. I picked it up and squinted at it in the dim light from the fire outside. At first glance, it looked like one of her usual shots, trees and shadows, but then I saw it, a tall figure standing between two trees in the background. It wasn't human, its arms were too long, its shoulders too broad, and its head looked almost cone-shaped. Before I could say anything, Max let out a loud bark and bolted into the woods. "Max!" Emma screamed as she ran after him. "Emma, stop!" Mom shouted as she grabbed her camera and followed her into the darkness. Dad came running back toward us with his flashlight flickering weakly in his hand. "Stay here," he yelled at me before disappearing after them. I wanted to stay put, I really did, but sitting alone in that RV with those sounds getting louder outside, no way. I grabbed my own flashlight from under my bunk and ran after them. The forest felt different at night, bigger somehow, and every shadow looked like it was moving. I followed their voices as best as I could, until I found them standing in another clearing not far from where we'd parked. Mom was holding Emma tightly, while Dad shone his flashlight around frantically. Max was gone, no barking, no growling, just gone. What happened? I asked breathlessly as I stumbled into the clearing. "He chased something," Emma said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal." Before anyone could say anything else, we all froze as another sound echoed through the woods, a deep growl that made my skin crawl. And then we saw them, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, watching us from between the trees all around us. There were at least 5 or 6 pairs of them at first, but then more appeared. They didn't move closer right away. They just watched us silently from the shadows like they were deciding what to do next. "We need to go," Dad whispered urgently as he grabbed Mom's arm and started pulling her back toward where we'd left the RV. But before we could take more than a few steps back, one of them stepped into view, a massive figure covered in thick fur that glistened faintly in our flashlight's beams. It stood upright like a person, but towered over even my dad by at least 2 feet, and its eyes weren't glowing anymore. They were staring directly at us with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. None of us moved. None of us even breathed, as more figures slowly emerged from behind it until we were completely surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist but somehow did. And for some reason, they didn't attack us right away. They just stood there, watching, waiting. We stood frozen in that clearing, surrounded by these things. I didn't know what to call them. They weren't animals, but they weren't people either. They were huge, some taller than Dad, and one of them looked like it could touch the tops of the trees if it wanted to. Their fur was thick and dark, blending into the shadows, but their eyes were sharp and intelligent, like they were studying us just as much as we were staring at them. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Even Max was silent now wherever he was. Finally, Dad broke the silence. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low and steady, like he was trying not to spook them. He grabbed Mom's hand and motioned for Emma and me to follow him back toward the RV. But as soon as we took a step, the biggest one, the one that had to be at least 12 feet tall, stepped forward and let out this deep rumbling sound that made my whole body vibrate. It wasn't a growl exactly. It was more like a warning. "Stop," Mom whispered, grabbing Dad's arm. "They don't want us to leave." "What do you mean they don't want us to leave?" Dad hissed back. "We can't just stand here. They're not attacking us," Mom said quietly, her eyes locked on the creatures. "If they wanted to hurt us, they would have done it already." She was right. As terrifying as they were, none of them had made a move toward us. They were just standing there watching us with those piercing eyes. Then something strange happened. One of the smaller ones, a little shorter than Dad but still massive, stepped forward and crouched down near the ground. It picked up a handful of stones and started arranging them in a pattern, a circle with lines crossing through it. When it was done, it looked up at us like it was waiting for some kind of response. "What is it doing?" Emma whispered, clutching my arm so tightly it hurt. "I think," Mom started, her voice shaking slightly, "I think it's trying to communicate." "Communicate?" Dad snapped. "With rocks? This is insane." But I didn't think it was insane at all. There was something about the way it moved, so deliberate and careful, that made me believe Mom was right. These things weren't just animals, they were smart. Suddenly, one of them let out a low sound, not quite a growl but not quite a word either, and I felt this strange pressure in my head, like someone was trying to talk to me without using words. It wasn't clear or loud. It was more like emotions or images flashing through my mind. Trees being cut down, animals running away, fire burning through the forest, and then I understood. They're angry, I said softly before I even realized I was speaking out loud. Everyone turned to look at me. What are you talking about? Dad asked sharply. They're angry because we destroyed their home, I said, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what I'd felt. The logging company, your company, cut down their trees. Dad's face went pale. That's ridiculous, he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced anymore. Before anyone could say anything else, another one of the creatures stepped forward, this one even bigger than the last, and pointed toward Emma with one long finger. She flinched and took a step back, but it didn't move any closer. Instead, it pointed again, and then gestured toward the woods behind it. They want me to go with them, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. No way, Dad said immediately. You're not going anywhere. But Emma didn't look scared anymore. Not really. She looked curious. I think they're trying to show us something, she said hesitantly. Absolutely not, Dad snapped. We're going back to the RV right now. But before he could grab her arm, Emma took a step forward, and then another, and suddenly she was standing right in front of the biggest one. It looked down at her with those sharp eyes, and made another low rumbling sound that sent chills down my spine. Emma, Mom shouted, but she didn't turn around. I'll be okay, Emma said over her shoulder before disappearing into the trees with the creatures following close behind her. For a moment, none of us moved or spoke. Then Dad spun around and started marching back toward the RV. We're leaving, he barked over his shoulder. Now, but what about Emma? Mom cried, running after him. She made her choice, Dad snapped angrily, as he climbed into the driver's seat and started fumbling with the keys. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run after Emma and beg her to come back, but another part of me knew she wouldn't listen, not now that she'd made up her mind. And then something else happened, something even stranger than before. One of the creatures stepped out from behind the trees again, this time holding something in its hands, Max's collar. It walked slowly toward us and dropped it on the ground in front of me before stepping back into the shadows without making a sound. I picked up the collar with shaky hands and stared at it for what felt like forever before looking up at Mom and Dad. They're not going to hurt her, I said quietly. They just want us to understand. Understand what? Dad asked bitterly as he slammed his fist against the steering wheel. That this isn't our land, I said simply. It's theirs. The RV felt like a cage. Dad sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Mom was pacing back and forth, her camera still slung around her neck, but she wasn't taking pictures anymore. I sat by the window, staring out into the trees, clutching Max's collar in my hands. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like something was waiting. Emma was gone. She had walked off with those creatures like it was the most normal thing in the world. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she looked before she left. Calm, almost like she belonged with them. It didn't make sense. We can't just leave her, Mom said finally, breaking the silence. She made her choice. Dad snapped without looking at her. I'm not risking our lives for her bad decisions. She's 15. Mom shot back. She doesn't know what she's doing. Neither do we, Dad yelled, turning to face her. We don't even know what those things are. For all we know, they've already. He stopped himself and looked away, but I knew what he was going to say. They didn't hurt her, I said quietly. Both of them turned to look at me. If they wanted to hurt us, they would have done it already. Kevin, Dad started, but I cut him off. They're not monsters, I said firmly. They're just protecting their home. Protecting it from what? Mom asked softly. From us, I said. From people like Dad. Dad flinched like I'd slapped him. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then we heard it, a low howl that echoed through the trees, followed by a series of sharp cracks, like branches snapping under something heavy. It was coming from deeper in the woods. "That's Emma," Mom said suddenly, grabbing her camera and heading for the door. "Diana," Dad shouted, jumping up to stop her. "I'm not leaving my daughter out there," she yelled back, pulling free from his grip. I didn't wait for them to argue anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted out of the RV after Mom. Dad cursed under his breath and followed us a few seconds later. The forest felt different now, darker somehow, even though it wasn't completely night yet. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisting overhead like they were trying to block out the sky. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. We followed the sounds, howls and strange calls that didn't sound human, but also didn't sound entirely animal either. They were coming from all around us now, echoing through the trees in a way that made it impossible to tell where they were coming from. "Emma," Mom called out desperately. "Emma." No answer. Then we saw it, a faint glow in the distance, flickering through the trees like firelight. We ran toward it without thinking, crashing through bushes and stumbling over roots until we burst into another clearing. What we saw made my stomach twist into knots. Emma was standing in the middle of the clearing with the creatures all around her. There were at least a dozen of them now, big ones, small ones, all watching us with those sharp eyes that seemed to see right through you. In front of Emma stood the biggest one, the alpha male, and he was holding something in his massive hands, a broken tree branch covered in strange carvings that looked just like the symbols we'd seen on the trees and on our RV earlier. "What are you doing?" Mom cried as she ran toward Emma, but one of the smaller creatures stepped forward and let out a low growl that stopped her in her tracks. "I'm okay," Emma said calmly, turning to look at us. Her voice sounded different, softer somehow, like she wasn't scared at all. "Emma," Dad said firmly as he stepped forward, "we're leaving right now." "No," she said simply. "What do you mean no?" He snapped. "We're your family. They're my family too," Emma said quietly. "They're my family too," Emma said quietly. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. What was she talking about? "They showed me everything," Emma continued, looking at each of us in turn. "What we've done to their home. What people like Dad have done." Dad opened his mouth to argue, but Emma held up a hand to stop him. "It's not just about cutting down trees," she said softly. "It's about destroying everything. The animals, their food, their shelter, their lives." She turned to look at me then. "They don't want to hurt us. They just want us to leave. They told you this?" I asked hesitantly. She nodded. "Not with words, but I understood." "That's insane," Dad muttered under his breath. "It's not," I said quietly as I stepped forward. I felt it too, back in the clearing. Dad stared at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. "They want their home back," Emma said firmly, as she turned back toward the alpha male. He handed her the carved branch and stepped back into the circle of creatures behind him. "What are you doing?" Mom asked shakily, as Emma held up the branch for us to see. "This is their message," Emma said simply. "They want you to take it back, to show people what's happening here. And if we don't?" Dad asked bitterly. Emma didn't answer right away. She just looked at him with sad eyes before finally saying, "Then they'll protect their home, no matter what." For a long moment, none of us said anything. The clearing was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Emma stood there, holding the carved branch like it was the most important thing in the world. The creatures, Sasquatches, I guess, watched us silently, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim firelight. Dad broke the silence first. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "We're not taking orders from them." "Jack," Mom said softly, her voice trembling, "look around you. Do you really think we have a choice?" Dad looked at her, then at me, and finally back at Emma. I could see the conflict on his face, the way his jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't used to being powerless, but here, in this forest, surrounded by these creatures, he was. "They're not asking for much," Emma said quietly. They just want us to leave their land alone. And what happens if we don't? Dad asked bitterly. They'll fight, Emma said simply, and they'll win. The alpha male let out a low rumble then, a sound that wasn't threatening, but still sent chills down my spine. It was like he was agreeing with her. We have to do this, Mom said firmly. If we don't, if we ignore this, then we're no better than the people who destroyed their home in the first place. Dad looked at her like she'd just betrayed him. You don't understand what you're asking me to do, he said through gritted teeth. If I go back to the company with this, with some story about monsters in the woods, they'll laugh me out of the room. Then don't tell them about the creatures, I said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at me. Just tell them about the land, about how important it is to protect it. And what if they don't listen? Dad asked sharply. Then that's on them, Emma said calmly. But at least you'll have done the right thing. For a moment I thought Dad was going to argue again. But then he sighed. A deep, heavy sigh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep inside him, and rubbed his face with both hands. Fine, he muttered finally. I'll do it. Emma smiled, a small, sad smile, and handed him the carved branch. He took it reluctantly, holding it like it might bite him. The alpha male stepped forward then, towering over all of us, and let out another low rumble. This time, though, it felt different, calmer somehow, like he was thanking us. What about you? Mom asked Emma suddenly. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and I realized she was crying. Are you coming back with us? Emma hesitated for a moment, before shaking her head. I can't, she said softly. What do you mean you can't? Dad snapped. You're coming home with us right now. This is my home now, Emma said firmly. They need someone to help them, to understand them, and I can do that. You're 15, Dad shouted. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough. Emma shot back, her voice rising for the first time since this all started. I know that if we keep destroying everything around us, there won't be anything left, not for them, and not for us either. She's right, Mom whispered through her tears. She reached out and touched Emma's face gently, like she was memorizing every detail of it. I don't want to lose you, but I understand. Dad looked like he wanted to argue more, but when he saw the look on Mom's face and on Emma's, he just sighed again and turned away. I'll come back someday, Emma promised as she hugged me tightly. Her voice cracked as she whispered in my ear, Take care of them for me. I will, I whispered back, trying not to cry. The creatures stepped aside as we turned to leave the clearing. They watched us silently as we made our way back through the trees toward the RV. When we got there, Dad climbed into the driver's seat without saying a word and started the engine. Mom sat beside him, staring out the window with tears streaming down her face. I sat in the back, clutching Max's collar, and looking out at the forest as it disappeared behind us. We didn't talk much on the drive back home. There wasn't much to say, but I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. The footprints, the carvings, the creatures, and Emma. When we got home, Dad kept his promise. He went to his company and told them about how important it was to stop logging in certain areas, to protect what little wilderness we had left. But he didn't mention anything about what we'd seen in those woods. Most of them didn't listen, at least not at first, but over time, things started to change. As for Emma, we never saw her again. Sometimes I wonder if she's still out there in those woods with them, helping them survive, protecting their home. But deep down, I know she is. And every time I see a forest or hear birds singing in the trees, I think of her, and I hope she's happy. That's how our story ends, or maybe it's just how it begins, because even though we left those woods behind us that day, a part of them will always stay with me, forever. My name is Douglas Mitchell. I'm 45 years old, and until recently I was a forest ranger up in northern Minnesota. I spent most of my life out in the woods, keeping trails clear and making sure campers didn't do anything stupid like starting wildfires. It was a simple life, and I loved it, until everything fell apart. 6 months ago, my wife Claire passed away, cancer. It came fast, and there wasn't much we could do. One day we were planning our retirement together, and the next, she was gone. After that, the house felt empty, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful, just hollow. I couldn't stay there anymore, so I retired early, sold the house, and bought a 1976 Winnebago Chieftain, a big old RV that would let me live off-grid for a while. I figured if I couldn't find peace at home, maybe I'd find it out in the wilderness. That's how I ended up here, in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. It's one of the most remote places you can imagine, hundreds of miles of forest, lakes, and silence. Perfect for someone looking to get away from everything, or so I thought. The campground I picked was about as isolated as it gets, a small clearing near an ancient Native American site. The locals called it Spirit Lake, though no one seemed too eager to explain why. The drive up was rough, dirt roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years, but when I finally parked the RV and stepped outside, it felt like I could breathe again for the first time in months. The air was crisp and cold, even for late autumn. Pines stretched up to the sky like cathedral spires, their needles whispering in the wind. It was beautiful in a way that made you feel small, like you were just a tiny piece of something much bigger. I spent the first day setting up camp. My years as a ranger came in handy. I knew how to make a fire pit, secure food from animals, and check for signs of dangerous wildlife. Everything seemed normal at first, until I found the totems. They were carved out of wood, tall weathered things with strange faces etched into them. Some looked like animals, others were harder to describe, twisted shapes with hollow eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. They were scattered around the edges of the clearing, half hidden by undergrowth. I figured they were some kind of Native American art left behind by whoever had lived here centuries ago. Beautiful in their own way, but unsettling too. There was something about them that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't explain why at the time. Later that evening, I drove into town to grab some supplies from a small general store and stopped by a diner for dinner, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's name and strangers stick out like sore thumbs. The owner was an older woman named Marge, who seemed friendly enough until she heard where I was camping. "You're staying out by Spirit Lake?" she asked, her tone shifting from polite curiosity to something closer to concern. "Yeah," I said between bites of meatloaf. "Why?" Marge hesitated for a moment before leaning in closer like she didn't want anyone else to hear. "This time of year, we call it the hungry season," she said quietly. I raised an eyebrow at that. "The hungry season," she nodded, but didn't elaborate much beyond that. Just muttered something about how winter brings out strange things in the woods and told me to be careful. I laughed it off at first, figured it was just some local superstition meant to scare tourists, but her words stuck with me as I drove back to camp that night. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun had dipped below the horizon and darkness had swallowed the forest whole. The only light came from my lantern and the faint glow of stars overhead. As I climbed into bed that night, Marge's warning echoed in my head. The hungry season. I told myself it was nothing, just an old woman trying to spook me. But deep down, something about this place already felt wrong, and it wouldn't take long for me to find out just how right she was. The first night passed quietly enough. The wind whispered through the pines, and the occasional crack of a branch breaking in the distance was the only sound. I told myself it was just deer or maybe a raccoon, nothing unusual for a forest this size. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. By morning, I felt silly for letting my imagination run wild. I brewed some coffee on the little propane stove in the RV and stepped outside to take in the view. The air was colder than it had been the day before, sharp enough to sting my nose and ears. Frost glittered on the ground like tiny diamonds. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were about 20 feet from my campsite, pressed into the frost-covered dirt. At first I thought they might be bear tracks, big ones, but as I crouched down to get a closer look, I realized they weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. The prints were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, with long claw marks at the tips. But what really threw me off was the shape, almost human but not quite. The toes were too long, and there was something wrong about them, like they didn't belong to any animal I knew of. I followed the tracks for a few yards before they disappeared into the underbrush. Whatever had made them must have been heavy. The ground was pressed down hard where it had walked, but there was no sign of fur or scat, nothing to give me a clue about what it might have been. I told myself it was probably just a bear with some kind of deformity, and tried not to think about it too much as I went about my day. But that uneasy feeling from the night before started creeping back in, stronger this time. That evening, as I sat by the campfire eating a can of chili, I heard it for the first time, the drumming. It started faintly, so soft at first that I thought it might just be my imagination. But as I sat there listening, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't music exactly, just a steady rhythm that seemed to come from all directions at once. Asterisk, thump, thump, thump. Asterisk, pause. Asterisk, thump, thump, thump. Asterisk. I stood up and turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was like the sound was bouncing off the trees, surrounding me completely. My heart started pounding in time with the rhythm as I strained my ears to hear anything else. Voices, footsteps. But there was nothing, just that steady drumming and the crackle of my fire. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was almost worse. It felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, things got stranger. When I stepped outside to check on my supplies, I found my food storage bag ripped open and scattered across the ground. Cans of soup were untouched. Whatever had done this wasn't interested in anything sealed up tight, but all my fresh food was gone. Bread, jerky, even an apple I'd been saving for later. At first I thought maybe a raccoon or coyote had gotten into it during the night, until I noticed how cleanly everything had been taken. There were no bite marks or claw marks on anything, just neat little piles of crumbs where my food used to be. Then there were the deer carcasses. I found them about half a mile from camp while hiking later that day. 3 of them lying in a clearing with their bodies arranged in some kind of pattern. Their legs were bent at strange angles, almost like someone or something had placed them there deliberately. The sight turned my stomach, but what really sent chills down my spine was how fresh they looked. There wasn't a single fly buzzing around or any sign of decay despite how cold it had been overnight. I pulled out my camera to take pictures, partly because I wanted proof if anyone asked about this later, and partly because documenting strange things had always been second nature to me as a ranger. But when I tried to snap a photo, nothing happened. The screen flickered once before going black completely. No matter what buttons I pressed or how many times I checked the battery, it wouldn't turn back on. By now, every instinct in me was screaming that something wasn't right here, that maybe Marge's warning hadn't just been small-town superstition after all. That evening brought more answers than I wanted, and none of them good. As dusk settled over the forest and shadows stretched long across my campsite, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape slipping between 2 trees just beyond the firelight. "Hello," I called out instinctively, before realizing how stupid that was. The shape froze for a moment before stepping closer into view, and that's when I saw it. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, with antlers sprouting from its head like some kind of twisted crown. Its body looked human in shape, but stretched too thin, its arms too long, and its legs bent backward like an animal's hindquarters. For one horrifying moment, our eyes met, or at least what should have been its eyes if its face hadn't been covered by some kind of bony mask with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. I stumbled backward toward my RV as fast as my legs would carry me without turning away from whatever this thing was, but when I blinked, it was gone, just vanished into thin air like smoke dissipating into nothingness. That night brought no rest, not with temperatures dropping so low that frost formed inside my RV windows despite having heat running full blast, and certainly not with everything else happening around me. The radio crackled to life at one point even though it hadn't worked since arriving here. Faint voices whispered words in some language I didn't recognize before fading back into static again moments later. And then there were those dreams, or maybe they weren't dreams at all. Visions of Claire standing outside under moonlight calling out softly for me, only for her voice to twist mid-sentence into something guttural and wrong. By dawn's light though, one thing became clear. Whatever lived out here wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, and neither could I, not yet anyway. By the time the third day rolled around, I was running on fumes. I hadn't slept more than a couple of hours, and every little sound outside had me jumping out of my skin. The forest, once so peaceful, now felt like it was closing in on me. I spent most of the day inside the RV, trying to convince myself I was safe in there. It was solid, with locks on the doors and thick walls to keep the cold out, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. Whatever was out there wasn't just some animal, it was something else entirely, something that didn't care about locks or walls. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the clearing, I decided to take a walk around camp. Maybe it was stupid, but sitting inside all day had made me feel like a caged animal. I needed to do something, anything, to keep my mind from spiraling. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold biting at my face as soon as I opened the door. The air felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on me. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the crunch of my boots on frost-covered ground. I didn't wander far, just a few yards from the RV, but that's when I saw it again. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees, too quick to make out any details, but then it stepped into the open, and my breath caught in my throat. It was taller than before, easily 15 feet now, and its antlers seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Its body was gaunt and skeletal, with skin stretched tight over its bones like old leather, and its face, God, its face looked like something out of a nightmare. A mask of bone with hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth that didn't move when it spoke. Yes, it spoke. At first I thought I was imagining it. The sound was faint, like wind whispering through the trees. But then I realized it wasn't just random noise, it was saying my name. Douglas. The voice was soft and familiar, almost comforting at first, until I realized where I'd heard it before. It was Claire's voice. Douglas, come here. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground as I stared at this thing, this Hodwindigo, and listened to it mimic my dead wife's voice perfectly. Douglas, why did you leave me? That broke me out of my trance. You're not her, I shouted, my voice shaking as much as my hands were. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious, before letting out a sound that could only be described as laughter, a low guttural noise that made my stomach churn. I bolted back to the RV, without looking back, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it tight. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. But then, things got worse. The temperature inside the RV plummeted so fast that frost started forming on the windows within seconds. My breath came out in visible puffs as I scrambled to grab a blanket from the bed and wrap it around myself, and then the knocking started. It wasn't loud, just a soft tap 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 against the door, but it sent chills down my spine all the same. Douglas, the voice came again, Claire's voice, but this time it sounded closer, like she was standing right outside. Let me in, please. I squeezed my eyes shut and covered my ears, trying to block out the sound. "You're not real," I whispered to myself over and over again. "You're not real." But then something slammed against the side of the RV so hard that it rocked on its wheels. My eyes flew open as another slam came, this time against the roof, and then another against one of the windows. The Wendigo wasn't just trying to scare me anymore. It wanted in. I don't know how long this went on. Minutes, hours. Time felt meaningless in those moments. But eventually everything went quiet again. I stayed huddled in a corner for what felt like forever before finally working up the courage to peek outside through one of the frosted windows. The clearing looked empty. No shadows moving between trees. No sign of anything unnatural. But I knew better than to let my guard down completely. That's when I noticed something strange on one of the windows. Words written in frost from asterisk inside asterisk the RV. Asterisk, the hungry one comes. Asterisk, my blood ran cold as I stared at those words. Words I hadn't written, and realized just how deep in over my head I really was. The next day brought more horrors. I woke up to find strange symbols carved into every tree around my campsite, symbols that matched those on the ancient petroglyphs I'd stumbled across earlier in my stay here. They seemed to pulse faintly under the morning light as if alive somehow. Worse still were asterisk, my own journal entries. Asterisk, flipping through pages from previous nights, revealed things written in handwriting identical to mine but containing memories or warnings. I didn't remember writing those. Don't trust your reflection, though to stay away from her voice. Thus, Dip wants you to join it. Asterisk. By now sleepwalking toward madness seemed inevitable, even hunger clawed differently. I found myself craving raw meat, despite years disliking rare steaks altogether. This wasn't just survival anymore, it felt personal now. The Wendigo wasn't hunting randomly. Asterisk, it wanted me. Asterisk. By the fourth night I was barely holding it together. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my thoughts felt jumbled, like my brain was running in circles. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Was I imagining all this? Was it just the isolation getting to me? Or was the Wendigo really out there waiting for me to slip up? I didn't have time to figure it out. That night, the storm came. It started with a low rumble in the distance, like thunder rolling across the forest. But when I looked outside, there weren't any clouds, just a clear, starless sky. The wind picked up next, howling through the trees and rattling the RV like it was made of tin. Then came the snow, thick, heavy flakes that fell so fast they covered everything in minutes. I tried to stay calm, but when the temperature inside the RV dropped again, colder than it had ever been, I knew this wasn't just a regular storm. This was asterisk. It asterisk. The Wendigo was coming for me. The first sign was the scratching. It started on the roof, a faint skittering sound like claws dragging across metal. I froze where I sat, every muscle in my body tensed as I listened. The scratching moved slowly, circling above me like whatever was up there was trying to find a way inside. Then came the banging, loud, violent thuds that shook the entire RV. It was on the roof 1 second, then at the back door the next, then at the windows. It wasn't random, it was testing me, looking for a weak spot. "Douglas," the voice came again. Claire's voice, but this time it sounded wrong, distorted like a recording played backward. "Let me in, you promised you'd never leave me." I pressed my hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The voice was inside my head now, echoing over and over again, until I thought I might scream. And then, silence. For a moment I thought maybe it had left, but then something hit the roof so hard that it caved in part of the ceiling. Snow and ice poured into the RV as I scrambled to grab whatever I could use as a weapon, a hunting knife from one of the drawers, and a flashlight that barely worked anymore. That's when I remembered the cache. Earlier that day, while wandering through the woods in a desperate attempt to clear my head, I'd stumbled across something buried beneath an old tree, a small wooden box filled with what looked like ancient weapons, spears, arrows and knives made of copper with strange symbols etched into them. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, just another piece of history left behind by whoever had lived here centuries ago. But now those weapons felt like my only chance. I grabbed one of the copper spears from where I'd stashed them under the bed and held it tightly as another crash shook the RV. The Wendigo wasn't just testing anymore, it was tearing its way inside. The back door burst open first, ripped clean off its hinges by those impossibly long arms. Snow swirled into the RV as I backed away toward the front, clutching the spear like a lifeline, and then, there it was. It ducked to fit through the doorway, but still had to hunch over once inside, the antlers scraping against what remained of the ceiling. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine as it let out a low growl that vibrated through my chest. "Douglas," the voice came again, softer this time but no less terrifying. I didn't wait for it to finish speaking. With every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged forward and drove the spear straight into its chest. For a moment, nothing happened. The Wendigo stared down at me with those empty sockets as if surprised by what I'd done. Then it let out an ear-piercing scream, a sound so loud and unnatural that it felt like my eardrums might burst. The creature staggered backward, clawing at the spear, embedded in its chest as black ichor oozed from the wound. The symbols on the copper glowed faintly in the dim light, a soft orange that grew brighter with every second. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Dropping everything else, I bolted out of the RV into the storm. The snow was blinding outside, thick flakes whipping through the air so fast they stung my skin like needles. The wind howled around me as I ran blindly through the forest, not caring where I ended up as long as it was far away from that thing. But no matter how far or fast I ran, I could still hear it behind me. Its footsteps were slow but steady, crunching through snow with a weight that made my stomach churn. And then there were its screams, high-pitched wails that echoed through the trees like some kind of twisted battle cry. I stumbled over roots and rocks more times than I could count, but kept going until finally, everything went quiet again. When I turned around, there was nothing but snow-covered trees behind me, no sign of footprints or shadows moving between them. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd won. But deep down, I knew better. By dawn's light, when exhaustion finally forced me to stop running and collapse against a tree trunk for support, something changed. My reflection in a nearby patch of ice caught my eye, and what stared back wasn't entirely me anymore. My eyes glowed faintly white now, frost clung unnaturally even where warmth should have melted. And hunger gnawed differently altogether. It wasn't food anymore calling, it just wasn't human. When I finally made it back to the RV, the storm had passed. The forest was quiet again, blanketed in a thick layer of snow that sparkled under the pale morning light. The Wendigo was gone, or at least I couldn't see it anymore, but the damage it had done was everywhere. The RV was a wreck, the roof had been torn apart, the back door hung crooked on its hinges, and the inside looked like a tornado had ripped through it. The copper spear was still lying on the floor, stained black with whatever passed for blood in that thing. I should have felt relieved, happy even, that I'd survived. But I didn't. Something was wrong. At first it was small things. My hands felt stiff, like they were frozen solid, despite the fire I'd managed to get going outside. My breath came out in thick white clouds, even though the air wasn't as cold as before. And then there was the hunger, a deep, gnawing ache in my stomach that wouldn't go away no matter how much I ate. By the time I packed up what little I could salvage and started driving south, I knew something inside me had changed. The first sign came when I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. No matter how far I drove, the trees outside all looked the same, tall pines stretching endlessly into the horizon. My compass spun uselessly on the dashboard, and even when I tried to follow the sun, it felt like I was going in circles. And then, There was the mirror. I glanced at it once, just for a second, and froze. My eyes weren't mine anymore. They were white as snow, and deep down, I knew what that meant. I wasn't escaping, I was becoming it. My name is Michael Reeves. I'm 38 years old, and not too long ago, I was a rodeo champion. People used to cheer for me, call me a legend, but life has a funny way of knocking you down when you get too comfortable. I made some bad choices. Gambling, mostly, lost more than I could afford, and ended up owing money to the kind of people you don't want to owe money to. So I ran. I borrowed an old 1982 Airstream trailer from a friend, and drove as far as I could. That's how I ended up in Sedona, Arizona, in a place called Devil's Canyon. The name should have been a warning, but at the time it felt like the perfect hiding spot, quiet, isolated, and far away from my troubles. The first thing that struck me about the area was how empty it felt. No cars, no people, just miles of red rock and desert stretching out in every direction. I stopped at a small gas station on the way to ask for directions to a campsite I'd heard about, one near some ancient cliff dwellings. The guy behind the counter was Navajo, older, with deep lines on his face, like he'd seen more than his share of hard days. When I asked him how to get there, he just stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "You don't want to go there," he said flatly. "Why not?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "It's not a place for you," he replied. "Not anymore." I laughed it off, thinking he was just being superstitious or trying to scare me, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of quiet fear, that stuck with me as I left the station and headed toward Devil's Canyon anyway. When I finally found the spot, it was exactly what I'd hoped for, completely isolated. The campsite was tucked into a narrow valley, surrounded by towering red cliffs. There were ancient petroglyphs carved into the rocks nearby, humanoid figures with animal heads that looked like they were watching me. It was eerie but also kind of fascinating. I parked the Airstream in what seemed like a good spot and started setting up camp. As I walked around, I noticed something strange, small piles of bones scattered here and there, like someone or something had been hunting nearby. Then there were the circles, perfect circles of dead animals, rabbits mostly, lying just outside the campsite boundary. It didn't make any sense. That night, as the sun dipped below the cliffs and darkness swallowed the canyon, an unsettling silence fell over the place. No wind, no crickets, no nothing. Just me and my thoughts, and they weren't exactly comforting company. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I'd been under a lot of stress lately, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe the old man at the gas station had been right. Something wasn't right about this place. The first night in Devil's Canyon was quiet, too quiet. I didn't sleep much, tossing and turning on the small bed in the Airstream. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me, but when I peeked out the window, there was nothing but darkness. The next morning, I tried to shake off the uneasiness. I told myself it was just nerves, maybe guilt, catching up to me for running away from my problems. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking up to the cliff dwellings nearby. They were incredible, ancient and worn by time, with faded handprints and carvings on the walls. The air felt heavy up there, like the place carried a weight I couldn't explain. That's when I noticed something strange. The petroglyphs, the carvings of those humanoid figures with animal heads, they weren't just random shapes. They seemed deliberate, like they were telling a story. One figure stood out, a man with a coyote's head, surrounded by smaller animals bowing to him. It gave me chills. By the time I got back to the Airstream, the sun was setting, and that eerie silence had returned. I tried to distract myself by making dinner, but my appetite was gone. Something about this place felt wrong, like it didn't want me here. That night, things got worse. I woke up around midnight to a sound outside, low and guttural, like an animal growling. My heart started racing as I sat up in bed and listened. The growling turned into something else. Words. Human words. It sounded like someone or something was speaking in a low, gravelly voice just outside the trailer. I froze, too scared to move. The voice was faint but clear enough to make out a few words. Leave, now. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, closer this time. Leave, now. Gripping my flashlight, I forced myself to peek out the window. Nothing, just darkness and shadows stretching across the desert floor. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Black handprints smeared across the outside of the Airstream's windows. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. They were too big to be human, but too small to belong to any animal I knew. I thought about leaving right then and there, but where would I go? Back to the people I owed money to? No way. So I stayed. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Every night that same voice came back, sometimes growling, sometimes whispering, but always saying the same thing. Leave, now. And every morning more handprints appeared on the windows inside this time. Dust storms started kicking up around my campsite out of nowhere. They'd come in fast and furious, but only seemed to happen right where I was parked. When they cleared, strange patterns were left in the sand, circles and symbols that looked almost like writing. The wildlife around me started acting off. Coyotes would gather at the edge of the campsite at night and just sit there staring at me with glowing eyes that reflected the moonlight. Birds perched on rocks during the day didn't sing or fly away when I got close. They just watched me. I tried calling for help on my old CB radio one night when things got really bad, but all I got was static, and then a voice cutting through it. You shouldn't be here. By the fourth day, I was running on almost no sleep. Every night, the voices outside got louder, and every morning the black handprints were back, more of them covering every window. I scrubbed them off, but they always returned. The air inside the Airstream felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. It was getting harder to breathe, harder to think. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Maybe I was just losing it. Maybe the stress of everything running from my debts, being out here alone, was messing with my mind. But as I walked through the canyon, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There was a woman standing in the distance, her back to me. She was old, with long grey hair that hung down her back in messy strands. She wore a tattered dress that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. At first I thought she might be lost or maybe a local who had wandered into the area, but then she turned around. Her face, it wasn't right. Her eyes were too big and too dark, like they didn't belong on a human face. Her mouth stretched into a wide grin that showed teeth far sharper than any person should have. She didn't say anything, just stood there staring at me with that awful smile. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked again, she was gone. Just gone. No footprints in the sand, no sign she'd ever been there. I ran back to the Airstream as fast as I could and locked myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the lock. For hours, I sat there in silence, clutching a kitchen knife and staring out the windows, waiting for her or whatever she was to come back. That night, things escalated. It started with the walls of the Airstream heating up. At first I thought it was just the desert sun lingering from the day, but this was different. The metal walls were so hot, they burned my fingers when I touched them, like someone had lit a fire outside and was trying to cook me alive. Then came the smell. It was thick and metallic, like blood mixed with something rotten. When I checked my water supply to see if something had spilled or spoiled, it wasn't water anymore. The clear liquid had turned dark red, thick and sticky like blood. I didn't even have time to process what was happening before the dream started. I don't know when I fell asleep. I must have passed out from exhaustion, but when I did, it felt like I was still awake. In the dream, I was running through the desert at night, barefoot and terrified. Something was chasing me, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes that moved faster than any animal I'd ever seen. No matter how fast I ran or how many times I turned to lose it, it stayed right behind me. When I woke up gasping for air, my feet were covered in sand and cuts, like I really had been running barefoot through the desert. That's when I realized this wasn't just in my head anymore. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let me leave. By the 5th day, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. Every time I looked in the mirror, my reflection seemed wrong. It wasn't just me staring back. Sometimes it would blink when I didn't, or its mouth would twitch into a smirk when mine stayed still. I stopped looking after that. I wanted to leave, but every time I worked up the courage to pack up and drive away, something stopped me. It wasn't just fear. It was like the canyon itself didn't want me to go. The airstream wouldn't start, no matter how many times I turned the key. The dust storms outside grew stronger whenever I tried to step out for more than a few minutes, forcing me back inside. It felt like I was trapped. That night, the voices came back, louder than ever. This time, they weren't just outside, they were inside the trailer with me. I could hear them whispering from the corners of the room, from behind the walls, even from under the floorboards. "Michael," they hissed, "you can't run." I pressed my hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The whispers turned into laughter, low and guttural, like an animal trying to mimic a human voice. When I opened my eyes again, I saw them. Black handprints were appearing on the inside of the windows right in front of me, one after another, faster and faster, until they covered every inch of glass. Then came the pounding. Something, or someone, was hitting the walls of the airstream from all sides, shaking it so hard that dishes fell from the cabinets and shattered on the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and stumbled outside, desperate to see what was out there. But as soon as I stepped into the open air, everything went still. The pounding stopped. The voices disappeared. The canyon was silent again. That's when I saw her, the old woman from before, standing at the edge of my campsite, with that same awful grin on her face. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her were figures, dozens of them, shrouded in shadows but with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. Some looked human, others didn't. Their shapes shifted as they moved closer, their bodies twisting into forms that defied logic, part animal, part human, part something else entirely. I stumbled backward toward the airstream, but before I could reach it, she spoke. "You've taken what isn't yours," she said in a voice that sounded like it came from everywhere at once. "Now you'll pay for it." "I don't know what you're talking about," I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. She tilted her head and pointed to the ground beneath my trailer. "You're standing on sacred ground," she said. "You've disturbed what should have been left alone." I didn't understand what she meant at first, but then I remembered the bones I'd seen scattered around when I first arrived, the strange symbols in the sand after every storm. This wasn't just any campsite. This was a place of power, and I'd parked right in the middle of it. Before I could say anything else, she raised her hand and snapped her fingers. The figures behind her surged forward like a wave of shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on me. I froze as the figures rushed toward me, their shapes shifting and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. One moment they looked human, the next they were animals, coyotes, snakes, birds, but not quite right. Their movements were too fast, too jerky, like they didn't belong in this world. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted back into the airstream, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely lock it. The pounding started again, harder this time, like they were trying to tear the trailer apart. The walls groaned under the pressure, and I could hear their voices, dozens of them, whispering, laughing, growling. "Michael, you can't hide." I backed away from the door, clutching the knife so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The air inside felt suffocating, thick with heat and that awful metallic smell. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, looking for anything that could help me. That's when I noticed something strange on the floor. The linoleum near the center of the trailer was peeling back, revealing a small wooden panel underneath. It didn't make sense. I'd been living in this airstream for days and never noticed it before. But now it was there, clear as day. The pounding outside grew louder, more frantic. Whatever was out there wasn't going to wait much longer. Swallowing my fear, I dropped to my knees and pried open the panel with my knife. Beneath it was a small hollow space filled with objects that made my blood run cold. There were bones, small ones, like they belonged to animals, or maybe even children, tied together with bits of string and feathers. There were jars filled with dark red liquid that smelled like copper and rot, and at the very bottom was an amulet made of stone, carved with symbols that matched the ones I'd seen in the sand outside. I didn't know what any of it meant, but I could feel the power radiating from it. It was ancient, heavy with meaning I couldn't begin to understand. The pounding stopped. For a moment, everything went silent again. No voices, no laughter, no shadows pressing against the windows, just me and the sound of my own ragged breathing. But then I heard it. A low growl coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned around and saw her, the old woman standing inside the airstream. She hadn't opened the door, or climbed through a window. She was just there, like she'd stepped through the walls themselves. Her grin was gone now, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "You shouldn't have touched that," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally in the small space. I stumbled backward, clutching the amulet in one hand and the knife in the other. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. She took a step closer, her body twisting and contorting as she moved. Her arms lengthened unnaturally, her fingers sharpening into claws. "You've disturbed what should have been left buried," she said. "Now you'll take its place." Before I could react, she lunged at me. I barely had time to move. She came at me so fast it was like she was made of smoke, her twisted arms reaching for my throat. I stumbled back, raising the amulet instinctively. The moment it touched the air between us, she stopped, frozen mid-lunge, her face twisting into something even more horrifying. The amulet burned in my hand, but I didn't dare drop it. Her eyes locked on it, wide with rage and fear. "You don't know what you're doing," she hissed, her voice no longer human. It was deeper now, layered with growls and echoes that made the walls of the airstream shudder. "I don't care," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Just leave me alone." She let out a scream, a high-pitched, bone-chilling wail that made my ears ring. The windows shattered, glass spraying everywhere as the walls of the airstream groaned under some invisible force. Outside, the shadows began to swirl, forming shapes, more of those creatures with glowing eyes and shifting bodies. They were closing in. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran. Clutching the amulet, I threw open the door and bolted into the night. The desert air hit me like a wall, thick with dust and heat. The swirling shadows followed me, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like tiny flames. Behind me, I could hear her laughter, low and guttural, echoing off the canyon walls. I ran toward the cliff dwellings, my only thought being that maybe, just maybe, there was something there that could help me. The ground seemed to shift under my feet as I ran, like the canyon itself was alive and trying to trip me up. The shadows were faster than me, darting ahead and blocking my path at every turn. When I finally reached the base of the cliffs, I was gasping for air, my legs burning with every step. The ancient carvings on the walls seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, their shapes shifting as if they were alive. I didn't have time to think about what it meant. I just climbed. The rocks were sharp and jagged, cutting into my hands as I scrambled upward. Below me, the shadows gathered at the base of the cliff, their glowing eyes watching my every move. They didn't climb, they didn't need to, they just waited. When I reached the top, I found myself standing in front of one of the ancient dwellings, a small cave carved into the rock face. Inside was a shallow altar covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of it was a circular carving that matched the amulet in my hand. I didn't know what else to do, so I placed the amulet into the carving. The moment it clicked into place, a wave of energy shot through the air. The shadows below let out an ear-piercing screech as they dissolved into smoke, their glowing eyes winking out one by one. The canyon fell silent again. No voices, no laughter, no pounding on the walls of my mind. But it wasn't over. Behind me, I heard her voice again, soft this time but filled with venom. "You think this will save you?" she whispered. I turned around slowly to see her standing at the edge of the cliff. Her form was less solid now, like she was fading in and out of existence. But her eyes, they burned with hatred. "You can't undo what's been done," she said. "You've taken something you can never give back." Before I could respond, she lunged at me again, but this time she passed right through me like smoke caught in a breeze. Her laughter echoed through the canyon as her form dissolved into nothingness. I stood there for what felt like hours, clutching my knees and trying to catch my breath. The amulet sat silently in its place on the altar, its glow fading until it looked like just another piece of stone. By the time I climbed back down the cliff, the canyon was eerily still. The air felt lighter, like whatever had been haunting this place was finally gone. I didn't see any more shadows, no glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. For the first time in days, it felt like I could breathe again. I made my way back to the airstream, stepping carefully over the shattered glass and scattered debris. The trailer looked like it had been through a wall, windows broken, walls dented, and everything inside tossed around like a tornado had hit it. But I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of there. To my surprise, when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life on the first try. It was like whatever had been keeping me here had finally let go. Without wasting another second, I threw the airstream into gear and sped out of Devil's Canyon as fast as the dirt road would let me. The drive felt surreal. The desert stretched out endlessly in front of me, bathed in the pale light of dawn. For a moment I started to believe it was over, that I'd escaped whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. But then I reached the next town. It was a small place, just a diner, a gas station, and a couple of run-down buildings. I pulled into the diner parking lot, desperate for food, and maybe some human company to remind me that I wasn't losing my mind. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in, and a few heads turned to look at me. That's when I noticed something was wrong. The way they looked at me, it wasn't normal. Their eyes widened in shock, their faces pale like they'd just seen a ghost. A waitress dropped her coffee pot, and it shattered on the floor. An old man sitting at the counter muttered something under his breath and made a strange gesture with his hand, like he was warding off evil. "What?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What's wrong?" No one answered. They just stared at me, frozen in place. Feeling uneasy, I turned to look at my reflection in the diner's window, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't my face staring back at me. It was the face of a coyote, sharp snout, glowing yellow eyes, fur bristling along its neck. My heart dropped into my stomach as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. "No," I whispered to myself. "This can't be real." But it was real. The reflection moved when I did, mimicking every twitch and movement like a cruel joke. My hands, my human hands, reached up to touch my face, but all I felt was smooth skin. Yet in the glass, I wasn't Michael Reeves anymore. I was one of them now, The people in the diner stayed silent as I backed out through the door and ran to my Airstream. My mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of curse? Was this what she meant when she said I couldn't undo what had been done? No matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, there were no answers, just that awful reflection staring back at me every time I caught my shadow in a mirror or window. I drove away from that town as fast as I could, not knowing where to go or what to do next. All I knew was that something inside me had changed, something that couldn't be undone. And now I'm still running, not from debt collectors or bad decisions, but from myself, because every night when the moon rises high above the desert sky, I hear them calling for me again, and deep down, part of me wants to answer,